The woman they sent back was standing in the middle of Hollow Creek Station when Harold Caldwell ripped the letter from her hand. Not asked for it, not requested, ripped it. The way a man tears a notice off a fence post when he's decided the fence belongs to him and everything nailed to it is his to destroy. The letter was the one Nathan had written her, the one with his careful handwriting and his promises about the house and the land and the life they would build. Harold crumpled it in his fist without reading a word and dropped it on the platform boards at Clara's feet. And he looked at her the way men like him look at things they've already decided are beneath them. Not with cruelty exactly, but with something worse. Indifference wearing the mask of disgust. "You should have said there was a child," he told her. "You should have been honest." Clara's boy was 2 years old, and he was holding her hand, and he didn't understand anything that was happening, except that the large man in the good coat was using a voice that made his mother go very still. If you've ever had someone make you feel like you don't deserve the ground you're standing on, if you've ever been looked at and found lacking before you opened your mouth, then you already know what Clara Whitmore felt on that platform. And if you haven't, consider yourself lucky. Most people aren't. Don't go anywhere. Stay with Clara's story until the end, because what happens next is the kind of thing that changes everything. For her, for the boy, and for a man standing across the platform who'd seen enough of the world to know when something was wrong. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what comes next, and hit that like button before you forget. And drop a comment. Tell me the city or country where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Clara had rehearsed it differently. In the weeks before she boarded the train in Missouri, she had practiced how she would step onto the platform in Wyoming. She had imagined it so many times it had worn grooves in her thinking. The way she would stand up straight, the way she would hold Eli's hand without clutching it too tight, the way she would smile at Nathan Caldwell and let him see that she was a capable woman, not a frightened one. She wasn't going to be the desperate widow with the worn-out dress and the hollowed-out eyes. She was going to be steady. She was going to be the kind of woman a man could see a future with. She had practiced. That was the thing that made what happened worse. The train pulled into Hollow Creek just past noon on a Wednesday, and the platform was crowded. The way frontier platforms always were. Men hauling freight, women meeting relatives, children underfoot, the whole shuffling commerce of a territory that was still deciding what it was going to become. Clara stepped down with Eli on her hip and her one leather suitcase in her other hand, and she looked out across the crowd for Nathan. She had a photograph of him. He'd sent it with his third letter. It was a formal photograph, the kind men sat for when they wanted to look like someone. He had a straight nose and a serious expression, and his hat was too centered on his head, which she had found oddly endearing. She'd studied that photograph until she could have described it from memory, and she looked for his face now among the waiting crowd, Eli squirming against her side. She didn't find it. What she found instead were 3 people standing apart from the crowd with the particular stillness of people who have decided in advance how something is going to go. Harold Caldwell, who was Nathan's older brother, stood in the center. He was a broad man in his mid-40s, with the kind of face that had once been handsome and had since become heavy. Beside him stood a woman Clara would later learn was Nathan's mother, Beatrice Caldwell, who had the expression of someone perpetually disappointed by what they've been served. And on Harold's other side stood a younger man with a clerk's demeanor who turned out to be a lawyer, though Clara wouldn't know that until later. They had no warmth in their faces when they looked at her. That was the first thing she noticed. Not hostility yet, just the complete absence of welcome. "Miss Whitmore," Harold said. "Mrs. Whitmore," she corrected quietly. Her late husband's name. She kept it for Eli's sake. Harold's eyes dropped to the boy. Eli had his head on Clara's shoulder, watching the strangers with the careful attention of young children who don't yet know they're supposed to pretend they're not watching. Harold looked at the child for a long moment, and then looked back at Clara, and something shifted in his expression that had nothing to do with warmth. "Nathan isn't here," he said. Clara waited. "We asked him to wait at the house," Harold continued. "We thought it best that we speak with you first." "Where is he?" Clara asked. The words came out before she'd thought them through, and she heard how they sounded. Too eager, too uncertain, and she straightened her spine a little and waited for Harold to answer. "That's not your concern just yet," he said. Beatrice Caldwell hadn't spoken. She was looking at Clara's dress, which was clean but old, and then at Clara's suitcase, which was the only one she had, and then at Eli, who had turned his face further into Clara's neck. "You didn't mention the child," Beatrice said. Her voice was the kind of voice that had given a great many instructions over the years, and had never been told no by anyone it considered worth listening to. "I mentioned him in my letters," Clara said, "twice. I said I had a young son." "You mentioned a child in passing," Harold said. "You didn't make clear that you were—" He paused, selecting his words with the deliberateness of a man who wanted to wound without appearing to. "That you had obligations. Prior obligations. My brother was under the impression he was corresponding with a woman who was available. Entirely available." Clara had gone very still. She could feel the platform boards beneath her feet, the weight of Eli against her side, the unfamiliar cold of the Wyoming wind on her face. She had come a long way. She had spent the last of her savings on the train ticket. She had told herself every day of the journey that whatever happened, she was going to handle it with composure, and she was going to remember that she deserved to be here, that she had been invited here, that no one could take that from her. But Harold Caldwell was looking at her like she was a bill of goods that had arrived damaged. "My son is 2 years old," she said. "His name is Eli. I am his mother. This is not something I misrepresented." "You misrepresented the situation," Harold said, and now there was an edge to it. He wasn't raising his voice. Men like Harold Caldwell rarely raised their voices in public. They had other ways of making themselves clear. "Nathan is a man of standing in this territory. His wife must be compatible with that standing. A widow with an existing child presents complications." "Complications," Clara repeated. "That's the word I used." Eli shifted against her hip. He'd picked up something in the air. Children always do, before they have language for it. And he made a small sound that wasn't quite a word and pressed his face harder against Clara's shoulder. She patted his back without thinking about it. An automatic motion, the bone-deep habit of a woman who had spent 2 years learning every shade of her child's discomfort. "I'd like to speak with Nathan," she said. "If you'll take me to him, I can speak with him directly." "That won't be possible," Harold said. "Why not?" "Because Nathan has agreed to defer to the family's judgment in this matter." The lawyer, who had been quiet throughout all of this, produced a folded paper from inside his coat and held it out to Clara. She stared at it for a moment before taking it with her free hand, the one not holding Eli, and she unfolded it awkwardly against her hip. It was a brief letter, formal. Nathan's signature was at the bottom, and the handwriting above it said, in careful legal language, that Nathan Caldwell was withdrawing his proposal of marriage in light of information that had come to light regarding the circumstances of the applicant. The applicant. She was the applicant. Harold Caldwell reached forward and took the letter from her hand. Not snatched it. Just reached forward with the casual certainty of a man who takes things because he's decided they're his to take, and crumpled it in his fist and let it fall to the platform boards. "The train back to Missouri departs at 4 o'clock, he said. "There's time enough for you to get something to eat, if you're careful with what you spend." And then he turned and walked away. Beatrice followed him without a backward glance. The lawyer lingered for half a second, his expression troubled in a way that didn't translate into action, and then he followed too. Clara stood on the platform boards of Hollow Creek Station with her crumpled letter at her feet and her boy on her hip and her suitcase in her hand. Around her, the platform continued its noise and commerce, people moving past with the comfortable obliviousness of people who have not just had their future canceled in front of them. She didn't cry. That detail matters. She had the feeling, but she pressed it down, not out of pride exactly, but because she was holding Eli and she didn't want him to feel her shake. He was already too quiet. He'd stopped squirming. She looked down at the crumpled letter on the platform boards. She thought about picking it up and thought about leaving it, and in the end, left it. Nathan had signed it. That was the thing. Nathan, who had written her careful letters with his two-centered hat, who had described the view from the porch of his ranch house and the way the mountains looked in November and the kind of supper he hoped they'd eat together on cold evenings. Nathan had signed a letter calling her an applicant and let his brother deliver it. She picked up her suitcase. It was heavier than she remembered. Around her, the platform had noticed. Not everyone, not the freight handlers and not the men deep in their conversations, but enough. A cluster of women near the station door had gone quiet. A man selling newspapers had stopped calling out. There was that particular silence that falls over a crowd when someone has witnessed a thing they're not quite sure how to respond to. Clara shifted Eli higher on her hip. "It's all right," she told him, which was the first time she'd lied to her son, and she hoped it wouldn't become a habit. She needed to think. She needed somewhere to sit that wasn't this platform with its witnesses and its crumpled letter and its 4 o'clock train to Missouri. She started walking toward the far end of the platform, away from the station door, away from the knot of watching people, away from where the Caldwell family had already disappeared back into whatever carriage had brought them. Eli had his cheek against her shoulder. She could feel his breath, the small, reliable rhythm of it. She'd spent $18 on the train fare. She had $11 left in the purse in her suitcase. $11 and a 2-year-old, and no one waiting for her back in Missouri. She'd let the room go, sold what little furniture she had, told the neighbors she was starting over. Starting over, that was what she'd called it. She'd made it sound like an adventure. Mrs. Hannigan next door had given her a jar of blackberry preserves for the journey and told her she was brave, and Clara had smiled and said she didn't feel brave, she just felt ready. She found a bench at the end of the platform and sat down on it, hard, and set the suitcase at her feet and held Eli in her lap. He pulled back from her shoulder and looked at her face with the unsettling directness of very small children and said, with his limited but growing command of language, "Mama sad?" "No," she said. "Mama's thinking." He accepted this because she said it steadily. He leaned back against her chest and looked out at the platform with his serious dark eyes. She thought. She had $11. She had a child. She was in a town she didn't know, in a territory she'd never been to, on a platform she'd been told to leave. The Missouri boarding house where she'd spent the last 2 years was not somewhere she could go back to. Not with her pride, not on $11, not having told everyone she was starting over. She thought about the Caldwell family and the lawyer's letter and Harold's face when he'd taken Nathan's words from her hand. He hadn't done it viciously. That was what she kept coming back to. He'd done it the way you dispose of something that no longer serves a purpose, efficiently and without sentiment, and then he'd given her train times. He'd given her train times. As if the only possible response to what he'd just done was to leave. Eli made a small, contented sound in her lap. He'd found the edge of her coat button and was working at it with his fingers, the mechanical pleasure of small hands with something to fiddle with. Clara watched him for a moment and felt something settle in her chest. Not peace exactly, but something in that direction. Determination, maybe. Or just refusal. She was not getting on the 4 o'clock train. She didn't know yet what she was going to do instead. She had $11 and a toddler and no plan. But she was not getting on that train and going back to Missouri to explain to Mrs. Hannigan and everyone else that the brave adventure had lasted one afternoon and ended on a platform, and that the man with the 2-centered hat had sent his brother with a lawyer to tell her she was a complication. She stood up, settled Eli against her hip again, picked up her suitcase. She would find a boarding house. She would spend tonight in Hollow Creek, and tomorrow she would figure out the next part. She had stretched $11 further than that before. She had managed harder situations than this. Not many, but some. She was walking back along the platform toward the station when she heard it. "The lady staying or going?" The voice came from her left, and she turned toward it without thinking. A man was leaning against the platform railing about 20 feet away, his arms crossed and his hat pushed back on his head, watching her with the frank attention of someone who has been watching for a while and isn't embarrassed about it. He was tall and broad-shouldered and somewhere in his mid-30s, with several days of stubble and the particular weathering of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. He wasn't one of the Caldwell people. She'd have remembered him. "That's my business," Clara said. "Fair enough," the man said. He didn't push it. He just stood there, easy, looking at her with an expression that wasn't quite sympathy and wasn't quite curiosity, but something in between. She kept walking. "The family that was just talking at you," the man said from behind her. "Those were the Caldwells." She stopped. "I know who they were," she said, without turning around. "What they did was—" He paused, choosing the word. "Wrong. That's the word for it." Clara turned then. She looked at him from across the 20 feet of platform boards between them, this stranger with his pushed-back hat and his crossed arms and his opinion about what she'd just gone through. "I didn't ask for your assessment," she said. "No," he said. "You didn't." He held her gaze without flinching and without apology, and there was something in that, in being looked at without pity, and without the kind of careful condescension she'd been receiving for the last half hour, that made her feel, briefly, like herself. "Wyatt Mercer," he said, and uncrossed his arms, though he didn't come any closer. She looked at him for a moment longer. "Clara Whitmore," she said. He nodded at Eli, who had turned his head to look at the stranger with his usual careful attention. "And the young man?" "Eli," she said. "My son." "He's got a steady look about him," Wyatt said. "Good sign." Eli considered the man gravely and then leaned back against his mother's shoulder, which apparently constituted his verdict. Clara turned back toward the station. She had taken 4 steps when she heard Harold Caldwell's voice coming around the corner of the station building, louder now than it had been, carrying the particular clarity of a man who wasn't making any effort to keep his voice down because he didn't have to. "Made her situation entirely clear," Harold was saying to someone. "She came here under false pretenses. Nathan is fortunate the family was here to—" He came around the corner and saw her and stopped. The person he was speaking to, the county sheriff, Clara realized with a sick drop in her stomach, came around behind him and stopped too. Harold's expression didn't change. He had the kind of face that was very good at not changing. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I see you're still on the platform." "I am," Clara said. "The 4 o'clock. I heard you the first time, Mr. Caldwell." Something shifted in Harold's expression then, just slightly. He had not expected her to be standing there with her suitcase and her boy, looking at him steadily. He'd expected, she understood this suddenly with absolute clarity, he'd expected her to be gone already, because that was how it worked in his experience. You told people what would happen, and they went ahead and let it happen. "Sheriff Briggs," Harold said, without looking away from Clara, "this is the woman I was telling you about, the one who came on the mail order train." The sheriff was a medium-sized man with a tobacco-stained mustache and an expression that suggested he'd rather be somewhere else. "Ma'am," he said. "There may be a vagrancy concern," Harold said, "if she hasn't arranged accommodation." Clara felt the cold of that land on her like a physical thing. Vagrancy. He was going to have her removed. He was going to use the law to complete what the crumpled letter had started, standing on the platform in front of the crowd that had gone quiet again, in front of her son who was watching Harold Caldwell with those careful dark eyes. She opened her mouth to speak and didn't know what was going to come out of it. What came out instead was Wyatt Mercer's voice, from behind her and to her left. "She's not a vagrant," he said. "She's a guest." Harold turned his head slowly. The sheriff turned too. Clara turned halfway, enough to see Wyatt walking toward them from the railing, his hat still pushed back, his hands at his sides. "Guest?" Harold said. The word sounded like something he'd found in a trap. "At my ranch," Wyatt said. "She's coming to stay at my ranch, so there's no vagrancy concern." He said it with the flat certainty of someone stating a weather fact. Harold stared at him. "You're Mercer," he said. "The Mercer property. The one out on the North Ridge. That's right. You don't know this woman." "I know enough," Wyatt said. He had come to stand slightly to Clara's left, not between her and Harold, but close enough that his presence was clear. "Sheriff, everything in order?" The sheriff looked between Harold and Wyatt and at Clara and at Eli and worked his mustache for a moment. "Don't see any issue," he said finally, with the careful neutrality of a man navigating between 2 people he didn't want to be at odds with. "Long as the lady's got somewhere to be." "She does," Wyatt said. Harold looked at Clara for a long moment. The expression on his face was not anger. She would have understood anger. It was something colder. Assessment. Recalculation. "This isn't finished, Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said. Again, quietly. Harold's jaw tightened. Then he turned and walked back around the corner of the station building without another word. The lawyer, who had appeared somewhere during all of this, followed quickly after. The sheriff touched the brim of his hat at no one in particular and walked away. The crowd that had gathered, and there was one now, a genuine one, people who had stopped moving and were watching, began very slowly to return to its business. The noise of the platform reassembled itself around them. Clara stood still. She was aware of a slight trembling in her knees that she hoped didn't show in anything external. She shifted Eli on her hip, the automatic motion of it, and Eli was still watching the corner where Harold had disappeared with that focused frown he used when he was working something out. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," Wyatt said. I don't know you. I know that too. She looked at him directly for the first time. Close up, in the afternoon light, he was older than she'd initially thought, or maybe just harder used. There were fine lines at the corners of his eyes from squinting in the sun, and his coat had been mended at one elbow. He was not a wealthy man. He did not look like a man who did things for calculated reasons. What kind of ranch? She asked. Cattle and some crops, he said. North of town, about 4 miles. It's not... He stopped. It's not much, but there's a room. 2 rooms, actually, now that I think of it. The one I use for storage mostly, but there's a bed frame in it. You're offering this to a woman you met 20 minutes ago, Clara said. Met is generous, he said. I watched you have a very bad 20 minutes. Why? He looked at her without looking away from her. Because it was wrong, he said. What they did. And I'm not in the habit of watching wrong things happen when there's something I can do about it. Clara looked at him for a long moment. She had $11. She had Eli. She had a 4 o'clock train she'd already decided she wasn't taking, and a boarding house she'd have to find with money she couldn't spare, and Harold Caldwell's voice in her head saying vagrancy. She had also, she recognized, a strange aching feeling that had something to do with being looked at, really looked at, by this stranger with his pushed-back hat, and not found lacking. I'll need to be useful, she said. I need to contribute. Work for the room. There's plenty of work, Wyatt said. Always is. And I won't be made to feel like I owe you something I can't repay. I'm not Harold Caldwell, he said. It wasn't a boast. It was just information. Clara looked at her son. Eli had turned his head back toward Wyatt and was watching him with those serious dark eyes, and Wyatt looked back at him with the same seriousness, not making a face or doing the things adults usually did to make small children feel managed, just looking at him level, like an equal. Eli reached out one small hand toward Wyatt, not quite touching, just reaching. Wyatt's expression shifted, barely, just around the eyes, and he extended one finger, and Eli grabbed it with his whole fist and held on. Clara watched this and felt something break open in her chest that wasn't sorrow and wasn't joy and wasn't hope exactly, but was something that had to do with all 3 of them, and she breathed it in and breathed it back out again and picked up her suitcase. 4 miles north, she said. There's a wagon, Wyatt said. At the livery. We can go now if you're ready. She looked back once at the platform, at the station with its crowds and its noise and the corner where Harold Caldwell had disappeared, at the spot where her letter had been crumpled and dropped. She did not look for the letter. She didn't need it anymore. Yes, Clara Whitmore said. I'm ready. The wagon ride took the better part of an hour. Not 4 miles, it turned out, closer to 5, and the last stretch was over ground that hadn't fully decided whether it was a road or just a suggestion of one, rutted deep from the spring thaw and not yet settled back into something reliable. Clara held Eli in her lap and braced herself against the bench with her free hand and watched the landscape open up around them as Hollow Creek fell away behind, wide grassland going gold in the late afternoon light, stands of pine on the ridges, and above everything the kind of sky that makes a person from Missouri feel very small and very exposed in a way that is not entirely unpleasant. Wyatt drove without talking much. That turned out to be a thing about him. He could be quiet without making the quiet feel like a problem. He didn't fill the air with reassurances or explanations or apologies for the state of the road. He just drove, and occasionally pointed at something when it seemed worth pointing at. A hawk on a fence post, a pair of mule deer moving through the grass 200 yards out, a formation of rock on the far ridge that caught the light in a particular way. Eli fell asleep against Clara's chest before they'd gone a mile. He does that, she said, more to herself than to Wyatt. Goes from completely awake to completely out. No warning. Sounds efficient, Wyatt said. It's the one thing he does that's easy. She felt Wyatt glance at her briefly, but he didn't ask anything, and she didn't elaborate. That was something else about him she was beginning to notice. He didn't push. He offered things and then let you decide. The ranch came into view around a long curve in the trail. Not dramatically, not the way places and stories announce themselves, but gradually, the way things really appear when you're approaching them across flat ground. A main house, 2 stories, but the second floor clearly unfinished or unused, with a porch running the full front length. A barn that was newer than the house and better maintained, which told her something about the man's priorities. 3 smaller outbuildings. A well. A vegetable patch that had clearly been started and then somewhat abandoned, the way things get abandoned when there's only one person to do everything. A fence line that needed work in several places. Chickens moving around the yard with the self-important energy of chickens everywhere. "It's not finished," Wyatt said. "The house. I was going to... There was more I intended to do. Haven't gotten to it." "It's standing," Clara said. "That's what matters." He looked at her when she said that, a quick sideways look, and she couldn't quite read what was in it. He pulled up at the porch and set the brake and climbed down. Eli stirred but didn't wake, and Clara maneuvered carefully off the wagon bench with one hand, managing the descent awkwardly with the boy on her hip. Wyatt was there by the time she was down, not grabbing for Eli or trying to take him, just there, in case. She appreciated that. The in case. He carried her suitcase up onto the porch and pushed open the front door, and she followed him inside. The main room was large and spare and smelled like wood smoke and something cooking, which surprised her. She'd expected the cold of a house no one else lived in. Then she saw the cast iron stove in the corner and the pot sitting on it, and realized he'd started something before he went to town, banking on getting back at some point and wanting a hot meal when he did. A man who lived alone and still thought about coming home to a hot meal. She filed that away. "The room's through here," he said, and led her down a short hallway to a door at the back of the house. I was right that it was used for storage. There were crates along one wall, rope and tools, and a saddle that had seen better days. But there was also, as advertised, a bed frame with a rope base, and a mattress rolled at one end that looked like it had been stored wrapped in canvas. "I'll need to..." he began. "I can set up the bed," she said, "if you have sheets." "In the trunk in my room," he said. "Top of the house. I'll get them." She set Eli down on the floor in the corner. He stirred, blinked at the unfamiliar ceiling, and then lay back down with the philosophical acceptance of a child who has learned that sometimes you just wake up somewhere different, and she began moving the crates to clear space while Wyatt went for the bedding. It took her 20 minutes to get the room into something livable. Wyatt came back with sheets that had clearly been washed and stored clean, which she hadn't quite expected, and between them they got the mattress unrolled and the bed made without any particular ceremony. He shifted the remaining crates to one side so there was a clear path to the single window. She opened the window and cold air came in with the smell of the high grass, and she left it open a crack. Eli had gone back to sleep on the cleared floor section in the corner, lying on his side with one hand tucked under his cheek. "He's out again," Wyatt observed. "Told you," Clara said. They stood in the small room for a moment with the sleeping child between them, 2 people who had met 3 hours ago and were now apparently going to share a roof, and the weight of the situation sat on both of them differently. Clara could feel it, the particular strangeness of being in an unfamiliar place that might, if things went in directions she couldn't yet predict, become a familiar one. "There's food," Wyatt said. "When you're ready." "I'll be right out," she said. He left, pulling the door most of the way closed behind him. Clara sat down on the edge of the newly made bed and put her face in her hands for exactly 30 seconds. She counted. 30 seconds of whatever that was: exhaustion, delayed shock, the specific grief of having a future dismantle itself in front of you in public. And then she took her hands down and looked at the room and at her sleeping son, and she did not allow herself to continue. She was here. The room was real. The mattress was solid under her. That was what was true. She got up and went out to eat. The food was beans and salt pork that had been cooking most of the afternoon, with cornbread that Wyatt made while she was in the room, mixing it with the ease of someone who'd been feeding himself for years and had gotten good at the particular things that kept a person alive. It wasn't fancy. It was hot, and there was enough of it, and it tasted like something real. And after the long day, Clara ate more than she'd expected to, and didn't feel embarrassed about it. Eli woke up during supper and came padding out of the back room with his hair pushed sideways, and his expression deeply confused about where he was. And he looked at Wyatt across the table with the suspicious concentration of a child recalibrating. "That's Wyatt," Clara told him. "He's letting us stay here for a while." Eli looked at Wyatt. Wyatt looked back at him, level, not performing anything. "Yat," Eli said, which was apparently his verdict on the name. "That works," Wyatt said. He ladled beans into a smaller bowl and set it on the table in front of the empty chair, and Eli climbed up onto it with the determined independence of a 2-year-old who would climb something or die trying, and Clara let him struggle with it until the very last moment before he was about to slide backward, and then steadied the chair without making anything of it. Wyatt watched this exchange and kept his thoughts about it to himself. After supper she cleaned up, which wasn't optional in her mind. She had said she would contribute and she'd meant it, and the kitchen showed the evidence of a man who was thorough about some things and had given up on others. The dishes were clean, the surfaces were not. She washed up with water from the pump in the yard, while Eli sat on the porch in the evening air and watched the chickens with the focused attention of someone observing a phenomenon he had never previously considered. Wyatt came out and sat on the porch steps and smoked his pipe, which was apparently something he did in the evenings, and Eli drifted gradually in his direction the way young children drift toward things that fascinate them. Not directly, but in a series of apparently unrelated movements that ended with him sitting on the step next to Wyatt, watching the smoke rise. "He going to be bothered by that?" Wyatt asked when Clara came out. "He smells like a chimney anyway," Clara said, nodding at Eli. "He's been attached to me all day." She sat in the chair on the porch. There was one chair, which he'd apparently brought out for her, since she hadn't noticed it there before, and she looked out at the property in the last of the evening light. The fence line that needed work was even more visible now. The vegetable garden was a small disaster of neglect. There were 2 missing boards on the barn's east side that she could see from here. "How long have you been on this land?" she asked. 6 years, Wyatt said. "Came out from Kansas. What brought you out this far?" He smoked for a moment. "Needed somewhere that was mine," he said, "and not much else." She understood that. She understood it better than she would have liked. "The Caldwells," she said. "How much trouble are they?" He took the pipe from his mouth and considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Harold Caldwell is the kind of man who decides the rules and then gets upset when other people don't know them," he said. "He's got money, and he's got connections in town, and he's used to both of those things solving problems for him. And I'm a problem he didn't solve today." "You're a problem he didn't expect," Wyatt said. "That's different, and probably worse." Clara let that settle. The chickens had retired for the evening. Eli was leaning against Wyatt's arm with the boneless ease of a very tired child, and Wyatt had gone still to accommodate it, his pipe in one hand, his other arm just there, not pulling the boy closer, not pushing him away, just present. "He said it wasn't finished," Clara said. "He's not wrong," Wyatt said. "Should I be worried?" "You should be aware," he said. "Worried doesn't do much good. Aware does." It was not a comforting answer. She respected him for not making it one. She put Eli to bed when the stars started to appear. He went down without much argument, the day having thoroughly used him up. And she came back out to find Wyatt had refilled the water bucket from the pump without being asked. She made a mental note of this as one of the ways a person showed themselves, the things they did when no one was asking. She leaned against the porch railing in the dark. "I need to understand something," she said. He waited. "You don't know me," she said. "You knew me for 20 minutes on a platform, and you told the sheriff I was a guest at your ranch. You offered me a room and supper. You—" She stopped, organized her thoughts. "Why?" "And I want a real answer, not something polite." Wyatt was quiet for long enough that she thought he was going to give her a polite answer anyway, and then he said, "I've been out on this land 6 years. I've built most of what's here myself, or close to it. And every year I think, this is the year it starts to feel like something. Not just a working property, but he paused, a place. And every year it doesn't quite. A room and a stranger with a child doesn't fix that," Clara said. "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." He turned the pipe over in his hands. "But watching a woman get crumpled up like a bad letter and told to go back where she came from does something to a man, specifically to me. I've been told to go back where I came from. I don't have a lot of patience for it." "What was done to me has a different weight than what was done to you," Clara said carefully. "Yes," he said without qualification. "It does. I'm not comparing them." She looked at his profile in the dark, the jaw, the set of his shoulders. He was not an easy man to read. She didn't know if that was a good quality or a protective one. "I'll pay rent when I can," she said. "I'll work for what I can't pay." But this is not going to be a situation where I owe you something I didn't agree to. Already said that. I'm saying it again so we both know it. All right, he said. We both know it. She went inside. The next morning she was up before him. She found this out later, that he was usually up before the light, and generally had the stove going and the animals fed by the time the sun cleared the ridge, and that no one had ever beaten him to it. She was at the stove when he came through the kitchen door at 5:40 in the morning with hay on his coat and the look of a man who has already been working for an hour and is surprised to find the kitchen warm and coffee on. He stopped in the doorway. I found the coffee, she said. There's eggs, too. I checked the hen house. He sat down at the table without saying anything about it, which she took as acceptance. Eli was still asleep. They ate in the comfortable quiet of two people who had, without quite deciding to, established a morning rhythm. In the days that followed, Clara learned the ranch the way she learned most things, by paying attention and doing the work before anyone explained it to her, and then adjusting when she got it wrong. She learned that the vegetable garden had been abandoned in the second week of May because a fence section had gone down and the whole thing needed to be restaked before any real planting could happen, and she restaked it herself over 2 afternoons while Eli played in the dirt beside her. She learned that the hens had 3 hiding places for eggs and that Wyatt had given up finding 2 of them, and she found both. She learned that the water in the morning tasted different from the water in the afternoon. The well had something mineral in it that was more noticeable when the ground was cold, and that this was fine, just something to know. She learned Wyatt's silences, that there were different kinds. The morning silence that was just how he operated before he'd spoken much to anyone, which was fine and comfortable. The focused silence when he was working something out about the property, which had a particular quality of concentration to it. And occasionally, not often, but enough to notice, a silence that was about something else, something further back. She didn't ask about that one. A week in, she found the financial records. Not snooping, she was cleaning the main room when she picked up a stack of papers from the side table to dust beneath them, and the top paper was an unpaid invoice from the feed supplier in town, dated 2 months ago, with a second notice stamp on it in red ink. She set it back exactly where it had been and kept cleaning and didn't say anything. But she thought about it. She thought about the fence that needed work, the barn boards, the garden abandoned for want of time, the house with its unfinished second floor. 6 years of a man working a property alone with no one to share the carrying of it, and the property slowly outpacing what one person could manage. She thought about Harold Caldwell and his lawyer and the way he'd looked at her on the platform, the way he'd immediately moved to use institutional mechanisms, the sheriff, the vagrancy concern, when simple rejection hadn't produced the result he wanted. She thought about Nathan, who had written her careful letters and signed the withdrawal with his name and then let his brother do the delivering. A week after she arrived, she was hanging washing on the line in the side yard, Eli orbiting around her with a stick he'd found, waging a private war against something invisible, when she heard the wagon coming up the trail. She straightened and shaded her eyes and watched it come around the long curve. 2 men. Not a freight wagon and not a ranch wagon. A proper carriage, the kind that was meant to suggest something about the people in it. It pulled up at the fence line, and the man who stepped down from the driving side was not Harold Caldwell. He was younger, closer to Clara's age, with Nathan's straight nose and his too careful posture. He stood at the fence and looked at her across the yard, and she knew before he said anything. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Caldwell," she said. Not a guess. A statement. He had the grace to look uncomfortable. He had Nathan's face, she thought, but not Nathan's photograph version of it. Not the stiff formal stillness. He just looked like a man who was trying to hold 2 contradictory things at once and wasn't managing it well. "Nathan," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at Eli, who had stopped his invisible war and was looking at the carriage with interest. "Is that my son?" she said. "Yes." Nathan Caldwell gripped the fence rail with both hands. He was wearing good clothes, but they were dusty from the road, and he hadn't shaved in several days, and he looked like a man who hadn't slept well since a particular Wednesday. "I wanted to explain," he said. "You don't have to," she said. "I know I don't. I wanted to." Clara dropped the shirt she'd been about to pin and crossed the yard to the fence. She stopped 5 feet from him and looked at him directly. He held her gaze, which she gave him credit for. "Your brother came," she said. With a lawyer, and a letter with your signature. Yes. You could have come yourself. Yes. You didn't. No. He looked down at the fence rail. He stopped, tried again. I was afraid of what you might say. Clara studied him. He had the look of a man who had disappointed himself and was only just beginning to understand the full dimensions of it. She recognized it. She'd worn that look a few times herself. What did you want to explain? She asked. My family, he began, is powerful and has strong opinions, and you've spent your whole life accounting for both of those things, she said. I understand. I'm not going to pretend I understand exactly what it cost you, but I understand the shape of it. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't expected, something between relief and misery. I didn't know Harold was going to bring a lawyer, he said. I told him I'd decided to. He stopped. I thought he was just going to meet you and talk. I didn't know he'd have documents. But you signed them, Clara said. Yes, he said. I signed them. That was the weight of it, sitting right there on the fence rail between them. She didn't move it, let it sit. What do you want, Mr. Caldwell? She asked. Why are you here? He lifted his eyes. I wanted to see if there was any. He couldn't finish the sentence because he didn't know what was at the end of it. She could see that clearly. There isn't, she said. Not unkindly, just plainly. Whatever you thought might be possible when you were writing letters and imagining a future, that's not possible now. Not because of what you did, though that's part of it. Because I'm not the same woman who stepped off that train. I've had a week to figure out what I'm going to do with myself, and you are not part of that calculation. Nathan looked at her for a long moment. Behind him, the other man in the carriage, his friend, she supposed, or his driver, she couldn't tell, sat very still with the carefully neutral expression of someone who has been asked to wait and is waiting. You're staying here, Nathan said, with Mercer. I'm staying here, she said. Yes. Something moved through Nathan's expression that might have been jealousy or might have been simple loss. It's hard to tell them apart from the outside. He's a good man, Nathan said quietly, like he wasn't quite saying it to her. He's been decent to me, she said. That's what I know. Nathan took his hands off the fence rail, straightened up, resettled his hat in a gesture that looked habitual, something he did when he was finishing something and didn't know what to do with his hands. My brother is going to keep making trouble, he said. I expected that. He doesn't. Nathan paused, choosing carefully. He doesn't consider it finished when things don't go his way. He'll try other avenues. Why are you telling me this? Nathan looked at her steadily. Because it's the only useful thing I can do, he said, and because you deserve at least one Caldwell who's honest with you. He got back in the carriage. The other man clicked at the horses without being told and turned the carriage around on the narrow trail with some difficulty, and Clara stood at the fence and watched it go back down toward town. Eli appeared at her elbow. He'd lost interest in the carriage and returned to his stick. Who dat? He asked. Nobody important, Clara said. She went back to the washing. She told Wyatt that evening, matter-of-factly, the way she was learning to tell him things, without decoration, without waiting to see how he'd react before she got to the important part. She told him Nathan had come, what he'd said about Harold. Wyatt was quiet through all of it. He was mending the section of fence she'd identified the first week. She'd mentioned it, and 2 days later he'd started on it, and now he was sitting at the kitchen table with the leather punch and the wire and working through it by lamplight. He came all the way out here to warn you, Wyatt said. That's how it seemed. Interesting. He worked the punch through the leather. Not something Harold would do. No, she agreed. Harold is going to come at this from a different angle, Wyatt said. He's got two things he can use, the property and the law. He'll try to make the property an issue somehow. This ranch borders Caldwell land on the north, so there's already friction there about water rights. He's been working at that for 2 years. Clara was quiet. And the law he'll try to use the way he tried it at the station, Wyatt continued. Not directly. He'll use connections. The county assessor is a man named Hicks, and Hicks has been doing business with the Caldwell family for a long time. What kind of business? The kind that doesn't get written down, Wyatt said. Clara looked at the fence piece he was mending, the methodical care of it, the loop of the wire, the placement of each piece. Why haven't you fought it already? She asked. The water rights issue. Been fighting it, he said. Just slowly. I've got documentation of my usage going back 5 years, and I've been adding to it. It's not the kind of fight you win fast. It's the kind you win by outlasting. Outlasting takes money, Clara said. He looked up at her. Yes, he said. It does. She looked back at him. They both understood what they were acknowledging, and neither of them made it more complicated than it was. I have an idea about the garden, she said. If you're willing to put in a proper cold frame, we can get 2 extra growing months. That's produce you can sell in town, not just eat. I know how a cold frame works, he said, but without sharpness. Then why don't you have one? Because I haven't had time to build it and grow things in it simultaneously, he said. When it's just you, you have to choose. It's not just you anymore, she said, and then heard how that sounded and felt heat rise in her face. I mean, there are 3 of us now, for the time being, so the choosing is different. Wyatt looked at her for a moment and then looked back at the fence mending. I can get the lumber for a cold frame, he said, if you can work out the dimensions. I can work out the dimensions, she said. They sat in the lamplight for another hour, he with his mending and she with the notebook she'd found in her suitcase. One of the letters she'd brought with her she'd folded inside it, but she put that at the back, and she began sketching dimensions for the cold frame. Practical figures, lengths and measurements and what she knew about the sun angle on the south side of the garden. She was not a woman who had been broken by what happened on that platform. She was beginning to understand this about herself more clearly than she had before. She had been shaken. She had sat with her face in her hands for 30 seconds and counted to herself. But the thing that had happened to her in Hollow Creek Station had not cracked the fundamental architecture of who she was, only the plans she'd arrived with. And plans could be revised. The trouble came on a Thursday, 3 weeks after Clara arrived. It came in the form of a man she didn't recognize, medium height, forgettable face, the kind of man who was designed to be ignored, who showed up at the fence line mid-morning while Wyatt was out checking the north pasture and Clara was in the garden with Eli. Ma'am, the man said. She looked up from the soil. I'm here on behalf of the county assessor's office, he said. He had a leather folder tucked under his arm. Routine assessment. We have some questions about the current occupancy of this property. Clara stood up. She had dirt on her knees and hands, and she did not brush them off. Wyatt Mercer owns this property, she said. He's out on the north pasture. You're welcome to wait for him. Actually, the man said, the questions are about you. He opened the leather folder. We have a report of an unauthorized occupant at this address, female, with a young child, who has no legal connection to the property or its owner. Eli had looked up from his digging at the sound of voices. He looked at the man and then at his mother with the serious attention he brought to all unclear situations. I'm a guest, Clara said, of the property owner, which makes me authorized. The report, the man said, flipping through his folder with the careful theatrics of someone who has rehearsed this, suggests that Mr. Mercer may have been coerced into this arrangement, that the woman in question arrived in Hollow Creek under false pretenses and has now placed herself in a position— Stop, Clara said. He stopped. She was aware of the cold coming up through the soil under her boots and the weight of Eli's attention on her, and the very great distance between this fence and the north pasture where Wyatt was working. Who filed that report? She asked. The assessor's office doesn't— I'm asking who filed it, she said, not whether you're required to tell me. The man looked at his folder. He was not, she realized, particularly committed to this errand. He was a man doing a job he'd been paid to do, and he hadn't quite anticipated the woman on the other side of the fence being this direct about it. The report was filed by Harold Caldwell, he said, finally, on behalf of his family's interest in properties adjacent to this one. Adjacent interest, Clara repeated. There's a water rights dispute. I know about the water rights dispute, Clara said, and I know that Harold Caldwell filed a vagrancy complaint against me 3 weeks ago at Hollow Creek Station, and that didn't work either, so he's trying a different approach. The man with the folder blinked. Here is what I'd like you to tell the county assessor, Clara said. My name is Clara Whitmore. I'm a guest of Mr. Wyatt Mercer, who owns this property outright. I am contributing to this property's operation in lieu of rent, with Mr. Mercer's full knowledge and agreement. I have no criminal record and no legal impediment to my being here. And if the assessor's office wants to pursue this matter, Mr. Mercer and I will be happy to provide documentation of that arrangement and of the unauthorized nature of this complaint. The man looked at her. Documentation, he said. I'll have it ready within the week, she said, with a certainty she did not entirely feel, because she had only just thought of it. He closed his folder. He looked at Eli, who had gone back to digging and was ignoring him entirely. He looked back at Clara. I'll pass that along, he said. Ma'am. He left. Clara stood at the garden fence and watched him go all the way back down the trail to the road. And when he was fully out of sight, she turned around and pressed her hands flat against the cold frame, lumber stacked against the garden fence, and breathed. She needed to think. She needed to think clearly and fast, because whatever she'd just told that man about documentation was either going to be true in a week or it was going to be a bluff Harold Caldwell would call, and she could not afford to have it be the latter. When Wyatt came back at noon, she told him about the visit the same way she told him everything, directly, without editorializing. He listened. His face did not do much while she talked, which she had come to understand was not absence of feeling, but the opposite of it. He went still when something mattered to him, the way an animal goes still when it's paying its fullest attention. Documentation of our arrangement, he said, when she'd finished. Yes. Which you told him we had. Which I told him we would have, she corrected, within the week. Something moved across his face that wasn't quite amusement but was adjacent to it. You bought us time. I bought us a week, she said. After that it needs to be real. He was quiet for a moment. I know a man in town, he said. He's not a lawyer, but he knows the law. He can help draft something proper. A written agreement between us, terms of tenancy and labor, nothing else, that is signed and dated and witnessed. That's what I was thinking, she said. I'll go to town tomorrow, he said. We'll go to town, she said, together. If Harold is going to push on this, I want to be seen there, not hiding. Wyatt looked at her across the kitchen table. That look again. The one she'd caught a few times now, the one she hadn't yet translated. All right, he said, together. That evening, after Eli was down, she sat on the porch alone. Wyatt had gone out to check the horses and hadn't come back yet, and she had a few minutes of the dark and the stars to herself. She thought about Harold Caldwell and his leather folder messenger and the specific ugliness of what he was doing, not confronting her, not coming himself, but sending intermediaries and using institutional language to apply pressure, like a man who'd learned early that institutions were more effective weapons than his own two hands. She thought about the cold frame that wasn't built yet, and the fence sections that weren't finished, and the unpaid invoice for feed that she hadn't mentioned to Wyatt because it hadn't been the right time. She thought about Eli, who had told her at supper that Yat had shown him how a knot worked, a real knot, a bowline, and had spent 15 minutes practicing it with a piece of rope, his small face folded in absolute concentration. She had arrived here with $11 and no plan and the vague intention of not getting on the 4 o'clock train. That had been the full extent of her strategy. And somehow, in 3 weeks, she had a room and a cold frame in progress, an assigned tenancy agreement in the works, and a clear picture of the enemy's tactics. It wasn't a victory. It wasn't anything close to a settled life. But it was also, measurably, more than she'd had on that platform. Footsteps on the porch boards. Wyatt came and sat on the steps with his pipe, but didn't light it, just turned it over in his hands. He's going to keep coming, Clara said. Yes, Wyatt said. What does he actually want? Not the water rights. That's a separate thing. What does he want with me specifically? Wyatt was quiet for a moment. Harold Caldwell wants the world to reflect his decisions, he said. He decided you were a mistake. He decided you should be gone. You're not gone. That's an offense to him. That's a very expensive thing to be offended by, Clara said. He can afford it, Wyatt said. That's the problem. She looked at the stars for a while. The Wyoming sky was something she was still adjusting to. The sheer quantity of it, the way it came down to the horizon on all sides, and made the darkness feel enormous. I'm not going anywhere, she said. I know, Wyatt said. I want to be clear about that. Not as a statement about you or this arrangement, just as a fact about me. I'm not going to be sent away again. I know, he said again. And then, after a moment, neither am I. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the dark outline of the ridge, his profile steady, the unlit pipe in his hand. She looked back at the stars. They sat on the porch a while longer without talking, and the silence was the comfortable kind, and the night was cold and clear, and somewhere in the barn one of the horses shifted and settled, and the ranch was quiet around them except for the grass moving in the high country wind, and nothing was finished, and nothing was resolved, and the week ahead was going to be hard. But Clara Whitmore was still here, and she had stopped counting to 30. They went to town the next morning, the three of them, in the wagon. Ely sat between them on the bench with his legs sticking straight out in his hat, a small battered thing Clara had sewn a new brim strap onto, pulled down over his forehead, watching the road unroll ahead of them with the solemn attention of a child who takes travel seriously. Wyatt drove. Clara sat with her hands in her lap and the notebook in her coat pocket, the one with the dimensions for the cold frame, and, in the back pages now, the notes she'd made the previous evening about the terms of the tenancy agreement, what it needed to say, what it needed to protect. She had been up until past midnight working through it. Wyatt's contact in town was a man named Amos Fitch, who operated out of a narrow office above the hardware store and described himself as a notary and general counsel, which in practice meant he handled the legal needs of people who couldn't afford proper lawyers and was honest about the difference. I was a small, precise man in his 60s with ink-stained fingers and a pair of spectacles he kept taking off and putting back on as he read. And when Clara laid out what she needed, he listened without interrupting and then spent a long moment looking at the ceiling. "You want a written cohabitation and labor agreement," he said. "Formal, witnessed, dated." "That covers the arrangement accurately," Clara said. "And the purpose of this document is to establish legal legitimacy of your presence on the Mercer property against a complaint lodged by the Caldwell family." "Primarily," Clara said, "though I'd also like it to be an accurate record of the actual arrangement, since that's what we have." Amos looked at Wyatt. "You're in agreement with this?" "It was her idea," Wyatt said. "But yes." Amos took his spectacles off and polished them with his shirt tail. "Harold Caldwell has been using the assessor's office as a convenience for about 4 years now," he said. "Hicks owes him money or favors. I've never been entirely certain which, but the practical effect is the same. This document won't stop Harold from filing complaints. What it will do is make those complaints look like what they are: harassment dressed up in official language." "That's what I want it to do," Clara said. "It'll also put both your names on a public record," Amos said. "Together. People in Hollow Creek will see it, talk about it." "Let them," Clara said. Amos looked at her over the rims of his spectacles. It was the look of a man recalibrating an expectation. Then he put the spectacles back on and picked up his pen. It took 2 hours. Amos was thorough, more thorough than Clara had expected, building the language carefully, anticipating challenges. The terms were clear and fair. Clara provided household management, garden operation, and general labor to the property. Wyatt provided housing, food, and a wage to be determined as the property's income allowed. The arrangement was voluntary on both sides and terminable by either party with 30 days' notice. Nothing in the document suggested anything beyond what it described. When it was signed and witnessed, Amos himself and the hardware store owner from downstairs, who came up with sawdust on his apron and signed with the slow concentration of a man for whom signing things was not a daily activity, Clara folded her copy and put it inside her coat against her chest. Amos walked them to the door. "One piece of advice," he said, addressing Clara more than Wyatt. "Get known in town. Not famous. Known. Harold Caldwell's power in Hollow Creek runs on other people not knowing you well enough to form their own opinion. You stay out on that ranch and let him tell the story, you'll lose the story." Clara looked at him. "Understood," she said. Outside on the street, Wyatt held the wagon lead while Eli investigated a horse trough with the focused interest of a 2-year-old who has spotted water. "The general store," Clara said. "We need supplies anyway," Wyatt agreed. They went to the general store, which was the center of Hollow Creek's social commerce, in the way that general stores always were in towns like this. The place where information moved, where people saw each other and formed opinions. The woman behind the counter was Margaret Pierce, who had been running the store since her husband's death 5 years ago, and who had, Clara would later learn, a very accurate sense of who was worth knowing and who wasn't. Margaret was in her late 40s, broad-shouldered, with a direct gaze and the kind of face that had been handsome and had deepened into something better. She looked at Clara with frank curiosity and no attempt to hide it. "You're the woman from the station," she said. The mail order bride the Caldwells turned away. "I am," Clara said. Clara Whitmore. I'm staying at the Mercer Ranch. I heard that too, Margaret said. She glanced at Eli, who was pulling at Clara's coat with both hands, because he had spotted a jar of horehound candies on the counter. And this is yours. Eli, Clara said. Yes. Margaret studied Eli for a moment, and Eli looked back at her with the same directness he brought to all adult strangers. Margaret reached into the candy jar without looking away from him, and produced one candy and set it on the counter in front of him. He looked at it, looked at his mother. Clara gave a slight nod, and he took it with both hands with the reverence due to a thing of value. What do you need? Margaret asked Clara. They went through the supply list together. Margaret knew her stock the way people know things they've spent years attending to, without looking, from memory, pulling from shelves and making notations in her ledger with the ease of someone who does the same thing dozens of times a day but hasn't gotten careless about it. When Clara mentioned the cold frame lumber, Margaret told her that the mill had a fresh delivery and that if they went before Friday, they'd get first selection. I'll remember that, Clara said. You plant that cold frame properly and you can sell extra produce to me, Margaret said. I pay fair. Last woman who had a kitchen garden out this way moved on 3 years ago, and I've been buying from a man in Cheyenne at considerable inconvenience. Clara looked at her. What counts as fair? Margaret told her. It was fair. More than fair, actually. Better than Clara had estimated. She recalculated something in her head. I can have the first yield by late August, she said, if the frame goes up this week. I'll hold you to that, Margaret said, without smiling, which was somehow more convincing than if she had. As they were loading the wagon, a woman passed on the boardwalk and gave Clara a look that was not friendly, not openly hostile, but the particular form of not friendly that comes from having already formed an opinion based on someone else's account. Clara met the look directly, and the woman moved on. A man coming out of the feed store across the street stared for a moment, and then looked away. A group of 3 women near the milliner's shop were talking with the careful nonchalance of people who are aware they're being observed. Hollow Creek had a story about Clara Whitmore, and it was Harold Caldwell's version. She was aware of this the way you're aware of weather, not paranoid about it, just factual. You handled yourself well in there, Wyatt said when they were moving. She's a good woman, Clara said. Margaret Pierce, she doesn't perform anything. No, he agreed. She doesn't. She'll be useful. To you or to the ranch? Both, Clara said. I'd rather they be the same thing. He glanced at her. She was looking at the road ahead, where Hollow Creek's main street was giving way to the open country north of town, and she had the expression of a person running calculations. She had, he was coming to understand, a mind that did not like to hold things without purpose. Everything she observed went into some kind of working assessment. It wasn't cold. It was the opposite, actually. It was what a person looked like when they cared enough about something to think hard about it. He looked back at the road. 3 weeks. She'd been at his ranch for 3 weeks. In that time, the vegetable garden had been replanted and the egg yield had increased because she'd found 2 hiding spots he'd given up on, and she'd reorganized the kitchen in a way that had saved him, by his estimate, about 20 minutes a day. 20 minutes that added up. Eli had started calling the ranch dog, a skeptical elderly hound named Price, who had always maintained a policy of general indifference toward human beings, by name, and Price, incomprehensibly, had started following the boy around the yard. He had not expected any of this. He had not expected someone like her. That thought sat with him for a while, and then he put it away because there were enough things to manage that were actual and immediate. And thinking about Clara Whitmore in terms that went beyond the practical was not something he could afford right now. Maybe not something he had any right to. The cold frame went up that week, as planned. It was a straightforward build, a timber frame with angled glass panels salvaged from a window section Wyatt had stored in the barn, and Clara was precise about the angle and the dimensions and the placement relative to the garden beds in a way that impressed him without her clearly intending to. She'd done the geometry on paper first. When he double-checked her figures, they were right. You've built one of these before, he said. I've read about building one, she said, and I'm good at reading and then doing. Different skill than building. Is it? She said, and handed him the next section of framing timber. Eli sat nearby in the dirt supervising or performing supervision. He had a stick and he was pointing at things with it, which was apparently how supervisory work was conducted when you were 2 years old, and Price lay beside him with the patience of an animal that had made peace with the inexplicable. The frame went up in 2 days. Clara had seeds started by the third. The timing would work, barely, but gardening was often barely, which was something she had learned from her mother in Missouri, who had gardened on the edge of possibility for 40 years and fed a family of 5 on it. She thought about her mother sometimes, in the evenings. She didn't do it indulgently, just thought about her. The particular way she'd held a trowel, the exact spot under the kitchen window where she'd kept her seed jars, and then let the thought go. Her mother had died 2 years before Eli was born, which meant she'd never met her grandson, and this was a loss Clara carried quietly and didn't put down, but had learned to carry without it slowing her stride. The letter arrived on a Thursday. It came through the post office in town, addressed to Wyatt from the county assessor's office. Wyatt opened it at the table and read it twice without expression and then passed it to Clara. It was formal language and it said, in essence, that a review of the property's water usage records for the past 2 years had revealed potential irregularities, and that the assessor's office was requesting access to the Mercer property for an official review of the well and irrigation draw, with particular reference to the water line that ran north toward the Caldwell grazing land. He's moving to the water rights, Clara said. Always was going to, Wyatt said. This is the bigger play. The complaint about you was just testing. This is the actual thing he's after. She read the letter again. It says irregularities. What irregularities? There aren't any, Wyatt said. I've kept records. I know exactly what I draw and when. Do you have those records here? In the box in the main room. All of them. I want to read them, she said. All of them. Tonight. He looked at her across the table. Clara. This is my fight too now, she said. Whether you intended that or not, it is. Harold is using me to get to you and using you to get to me, and I am not going to sit on the side of this and let you manage it alone. I want to read the records. I was quiet for a moment. All right, he said. I'll get the box. She spent that evening and the next morning going through 5 years of water usage records. Wyatt had kept them the way he kept everything. Not elegantly, not in the organized fashion of someone trained to keep records, but thoroughly. Every notation was there. Some entries were written in pencil in a hand that had been hasty, and some in ink when he'd had more time to be careful, and some on scraps of paper folded inside the proper ledger pages. But the numbers were all there, and they were consistent, and they told a clear story to anyone who was willing to read carefully. She spent 2 evenings recopying them into the notebook. Chronological, clean, totals by month and by season. The pattern showed his usage clearly, predictable, moderate, tied to the seasons in the way that legitimate agricultural use always was. There were no spikes that would suggest unauthorized diversion, no gaps that would suggest falsified records. When she showed Wyatt the organized version, he stared at it for a while. You did all this last night, he said. And this morning, she said. Eli helped by not napping, which meant I had to do it in shorter sections. He turned a page, turned another. She watched his face. Something in it had shifted, not softened exactly, but opened slightly, like a door that had been closed so long the person inside had forgotten it could be opened. Amos should have these, he said. Both versions, the originals and this. That was my thought, she said. And Margaret Pierce knows people in town. If Harold is going to try to use the assessor's office against the water rights, we need people who know the real situation before that process gets too far. You want to build allies, he said. I want people to know the truth before Harold's version is the only one they've heard, she said. Same principle as going to town together. He was quiet. You've thought about this a lot. I've had experience with situations where someone with more power than me decided what my story was going to be, she said. I've learned it's better to tell your own story first. He looked at her. There was something in his face that she couldn't quite name, and she looked away from it because she didn't have the spare capacity right now to analyze it. I'll go to Amos tomorrow, she said. You should come, but if you can't be away from the north pasture, I can go alone. I'll come, he said. The visit to Amos was productive and brief. Amos took the organized water records and the originals and looked at them with his spectacles on and his mouth in a thin line of concentration. He told them the assessor's review was a procedural process that couldn't be refused. They would have to allow access to the property, but that the documentation Clara had prepared would be central to any challenge of findings. He won't find anything, Wyatt said. He'll look for it anyway, Amos said. And if the assessor is Hicks's man, the question isn't what he finds, it's how he interprets it. Can we request an independent reviewer? Clara asked. Amos looked at her. You can make that argument, he said carefully. It would require petitioning the county board. It would take time and it might not succeed. But it would make the process visible, Clara said. It would make it harder for Hicks to manage quietly. Yes, Amos said. It would do that. Then I want to make that argument, she said. Amos looked at Wyatt. Wyatt nodded once, and there was something in the simple gesture of it, the immediate, unconditional agreement, that Clara filed away without examining. They filed the petition that afternoon. Amos drafted it, and Clara signed it alongside Wyatt, which was Amos's suggestion. Her name on the document alongside the property owners would complicate Harold's ability to frame this as simply a property dispute. Walking back to the wagon, Wyatt said quietly, You know he's going to react to this. I know, she said. He doesn't like being made visible. He operates in the spaces where things are quiet and managed. Then we'll make it loud, Clara said. The reaction came faster than either of them expected. 4 days after the petition was filed, 2 men rode up to the ranch in the late afternoon. Not county officials. Not anyone with a letter or a leather folder. 2 men on horseback. Big men. Not the kind who rode for pleasure, who stopped at the fence line and didn't get down. Clara was in the garden. Wyatt was at the barn. He came around the corner of the barn when he heard the horses and stopped when he saw the men at the fence. Mercer, the larger one said. His voice was flat, the kind of flat that was practiced. I know you, Wyatt said. He was walking toward the fence, steady, not hurrying. You work Caldwell land, north section. That's right, the man said. Mr. Caldwell asked us to convey something. Convey it then. The man looked past Wyatt at Clara, who had stood up from the garden and was watching from the far side of the yard with her hands loose at her sides. He sit on her for a moment in a way that was meant to communicate something, and then looked back at Wyatt. Mr. Caldwell wants the woman gone by end of the month, the man said, and the petition withdrawn. He's prepared to overlook the water issue on his end and let the assessment go the way it would naturally go, without interference. Wyatt looked at him. That it? That's the offer. It's not an offer, Wyatt said. An offer involves something given on both sides. What he's describing is a demand. The man shrugged. Call it what you like. End of the month. Clara had crossed the yard without deciding to. She was aware of moving, and then she was beside Wyatt at the fence, which was not a planned position, just where she ended up. The man on horseback looked at her again. Up close, he was older than she'd thought, with the look of someone who had spent 20 years doing work that suited neither his conscience nor his comfort, and had stopped thinking about either. You're the woman, he said. I am, Clara said, and I'll save you the ride back. The petition stays. My presence on this property stays. And Mr. Caldwell can do whatever he intends to do next, because apparently neither of us is going to guess at it correctly anyway. The man's expression didn't change. You understand what you're walking into. I've been walking into it since I got off a train 3 weeks ago, she said. I'm clear on what it is. The 2 men looked at each other. Then the larger one turned his horse, and the second one followed, and they rode back down the trail without another word. Clara stood at the fence after they were gone and felt the cold in her hands. She'd left her gloves by the garden bed. And the particular steadiness that comes after the moment of confrontation passes, and you realize you are still standing. Wyatt was beside her. She was aware of how close. That was direct, he said. Was it the wrong call? No, he said. It was the right call. A pause. He's going to escalate. I know. Clara. He waited until she looked at him. I need you to understand something. When I offered you that room at the station, I wasn't thinking about this. I wasn't thinking about any of this. I know that, she said, and I need you to know. He stopped, restarted. You didn't bring this on this ranch. This was already here. The water rights issue, Harold's interference with the assessment office. This was coming whether you were here or not. He's using me as a pressure point, she said. Yes, Wyatt said, but the underlying thing was already built. You just... He looked at the fence, at the place where the 2 men had been. You made it visible faster, and maybe that's better. Maybe letting it sit and rot in the quiet would have been worse in the end. She looked at the trail where the dust from the horses was still settling. I'm going to write to the county board myself, she said. Not through Amos, directly. A letter explaining what's happened from the beginning. The station, the assessor's office complaint about my presence, the petition, the men today. That's a long letter. I know how to write a long letter, she said. It came out with a slight edge, not aimed at him, just the residue of the last hour coming through, and he took it without reacting. I'll witness it, he said. When you're done. She went inside. Eli was awake from his nap and confused about why no one had come to get him, and she found him sitting up in the middle of the bed looking at the door with an expression of resigned patience that she felt, for a brief ridiculous moment, like laughing at. She picked him up and held him, and he grabbed a fistful of her hair with the automatic grip of a child who has recently woken and is reclaiming what's his, and she didn't try to extract it. We're all right, she told him, which was not exactly true and not exactly false. She wrote the letter that evening. It took 3 drafts. The first draft was too angry. She could feel it in the sentences, the way they pressed too hard, and she set it aside and made supper and came back to it when the anger had settled into something more useful. The second draft was too careful, had too many qualifications, and she crossed it out. The third draft was factual and unembellished, and she read it over twice and then she read it to Wyatt. He listened without interrupting. It's good, he said when she finished. It reads like someone who knows what happened and isn't trying to make it into something it isn't. That's what I wanted. Send it. She sealed it that night and Wyatt took it to the post office in the morning. What happened next came from a direction neither of them was watching. Margaret Pierce had a wider network than Clara had fully understood. Margaret had been in Hollow Creek for 20 years, had run the general store through her husband's illness and death, and through 2 hard winters and 1 flood. And she knew everyone who mattered in the territory, the way people know things they've paid for with time and attention. When Clara had come into the store that first week and spoken to her directly, Margaret had made a judgment, and Margaret's judgments tended to be accurate. She had talked, not gossiped. There was a difference, and Margaret understood it. She had talked to the women in her church circle, to the wives of 2 of the county board members, to the man who ran the land office, to the woman who kept the school. She had offered her account of what she'd observed, a woman of evident capability and straightforward manner who was operating Wyatt Mercer's ranch with more competence than it had seen in years, who had been treated with contempt by a powerful family for the offense of being poor and having a child, and who had done nothing since her arrival to merit the continued pressure being applied to her. Margaret didn't ask anyone to do anything. She just told them what she'd seen. The first sign of it was a woman Clara didn't recognize who stopped the wagon one afternoon when Clara was driving back from town alone. Wyatt was at the ranch and she'd gone for supplies, and introduced herself as the wife of a board member. She was a careful, well-dressed woman in her 50s with eyes that took things in quickly. "You're Clara Whitmore," the woman said. "I am," Clara said. "I'm Helen Garrity. My husband is on the county board." Clara looked at her steadily. "I wanted you to know," Helen Garrity said, "that your letter was received, and that there are people on the board who are asking questions about the assessor's office and its relationship with the Caldwell family." Clara kept her face very still. "I appreciate that." "The petition for independent review has support," Helen said. "I can't tell you it will succeed, but it has support." She nodded, a small, precise nod, and moved on. Clara sat in the wagon and held the reins and looked at the road for a moment. Then she drove home. She told Wyatt that evening. He was at the kitchen table with the lamp and his ledger, the feed invoice paid now, but she'd noticed that without commenting on it, and he set his pen down and listened. "Helen Garrity," he said. "You know her?" "Her husband is Garrity. He's been on the board 8 years. He's the one Harold's never quite managed to get in his pocket." "Because?" "Because Garrity doesn't need money and doesn't need favors," Wyatt said. "He's got land enough and family money enough that Harold doesn't have anything he wants." "That's useful," Clara said. "It might be," Wyatt said carefully. "It depends on how many people Harold has on the board compared to how many Garrity can bring." "It's a start," Clara said. "It's a start," he agreed. Eli had fallen asleep at the table, which was something he did when supper ran late. Just tilted over by degrees until his head was on his folded arms and he was out. Clara moved him to the cot without waking him, the well-practiced motion of a woman who had carried a sleeping child many times and knew how to do it without jarring him. When she came back, Wyatt was still at the table with his ledger, but he wasn't writing. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes." "Before all this?" He looked at the ledger. "In Missouri, what was your life like?" She sat down across from him. It was the first time he'd asked her anything directly personal, and she thought about how to answer it. "Hard," she said, "but not complicated. I had a husband who died of a fever when Eli was 4 months old. I had a room in a boarding house and work taking in sewing and mending. I had a son I was raising on not enough of anything." She paused. "I saw the advertisement because Mrs. Hannigan next door showed it to me. She thought I should try. I didn't think I would, and then I did, and I wrote to Nathan Caldwell, and he wrote back, and I thought—" She stopped. "What did you think?" Wyatt asked. "I thought it was a chance," she said, "not a rescue. I didn't need rescuing. I needed a chance, room to do more than just barely make it through." She looked at her hands on the table. "I told myself I was going in with clear eyes, no romantic notions, just an arrangement that could benefit both of us. And then? And then I got off the train," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Do you regret it?" She looked at him directly. "Which part?" "Coming here," he said. "All of it." She held his gaze. It was a more complicated question than it seemed because the honest answer had more than one layer, and she wasn't sure she could deliver all the layers simultaneously without some of them landing wrong. "No," she said, "not the way you mean it." He looked at her for a moment longer than was quite neutral, and then he looked back at the ledger. "I'll go over the water records again tomorrow," he said. "If the independent review is approved, I want to be ready for it." "I'll help you," she said. "I know," he said. Not surprised, just certain. She went to bed an hour later and lay in the dark, listening to the wind move across the high ground, the particular sound of Wyoming at night. Not loud, but enormous, like the whole of the territory was breathing. Eli was a warm weight in the cot beside the bed, his breath steady. She thought about Harold Caldwell in his Hollow Creek office or his family's fine house, calculating his next move. She thought about Nathan, who had come out to the fence and said she deserved at least one Caldwell who was honest with her and then had driven away. She thought about Helen Garrity and her precise nod and the word she'd used, support. She thought about Wyatt at the table with his ledger, asking her if she regretted coming here. She didn't know what they were building. She didn't know if it had a name yet or if it needed one. What she knew was that she was not the woman standing frozen on a platform anymore. She had been that woman for exactly as long as it took to find a bench and sit down on it and think, and then she had stopped being her. The wind moved. Eli breathed. Outside, somewhere near the barn, Old Price let out a single bark at something in the dark and then went quiet. Clara closed her eyes. There was still so much that could go wrong. Harold hadn't played his last card. She understood that clearly, felt it the way you feel weather coming before the sky shows it. The assessor's review was still pending. The board petition might fail. The two men on horseback had been a warning, not a conclusion, and warnings implied further conclusions to follow. But the cold frame was full of seedlings. The fence line was 3/4 mended. The records were organized in Amos Fitch's office in 2 clean copies. And Clara Whitmore's name was on a document at the county board office alongside a man who had looked at her across a table and said simply, "I know. The way you say it when something is so settled it doesn't need to be argued." She had not asked for any of this. She had asked only not to get on a train. Everything after that had been one decision at a time, one step at a time, in the direction of a life that was hers. She would take the next step when morning came. The morning the county board's response arrived, Clara was elbow-deep in the cold frame, transplanting seedlings that had gotten ahead of themselves in the warm spell, root-bound already, crowding each other, needing more space than she'd given them in the initial planting. Wyatt brought the letter out to her without opening it. He stood at the edge of the garden and held it out, and she looked at it for a moment with her dirty hands and then wiped them on her work apron and took it. She opened it standing there in the cold morning air with the seedlings at her feet and Eli somewhere behind her making engine noises with a piece of kindling he'd decided was a locomotive. She read it twice. Then she handed it back to Wyatt. "They approved the independent review," she said. He read it himself. His face did the thing it did when something mattered. Went still, went careful. Garrity, he said. And two others, Clara said. There were 3 votes in favor. The petition succeeded on the water rights question and on the assessor's conduct. She paused. The letter also says the original complaint about unauthorized occupancy of this property has been formally dismissed. Wyatt lowered the letter. He looked at her. That's Harold's complaint, he said. The one about you. Dismissed, she said. Officially, on the record. The word official sat between them for a moment. Official meant it went into the county record. It meant anyone who wanted to know the history of this matter could find, in the public documentation, that a complaint had been filed and dismissed as without merit. It meant Harold Caldwell's version of things had been weighed and found insufficient, in writing, by a body of people with the authority to say so. It was not everything. The water rights review was still pending, and a favorable vote on oversight didn't mean the underlying dispute was resolved. But it was something real and documented, and it could not be taken back. And Clara understood the difference between those 2 categories, what could be undone and what couldn't, better than most people. We should tell Amos, she said. This afternoon, Wyatt agreed. She turned back to the seedlings. She had 15 more to transplant, and the sun was already past where she'd wanted it for this work. She got back down and kept going, and Wyatt stood at the garden's edge for a moment longer before going back to the barn, and Eli came and crouched beside her with his locomotive kindling and watched her hands with the serious attention he brought to things he was trying to learn. What doing? He asked. Giving them room, she said. They were too close together. Things don't grow well when they're too crowded. He looked at the seedlings. Hurt? No, she said. They don't like being moved, but they'll be better for it. He accepted this and went back to his locomotive. The week that followed was the quietest stretch since she'd arrived. The board's response seemed to have created a pause in Harold's campaign, or at least in its visible aspects. No more men on horseback, no more letters from the assessor's office. The ranch filled the silence with its own demands. The north fence needed the last section finished. The south pasture had a drainage problem Wyatt had been managing with temporary measures for 2 seasons, and now needed addressing properly. And Clara's cold frame was producing more than she'd initially projected and needed a second round of transplanting. She made her first delivery to Margaret Pierce on a Tuesday morning, lettuces and radishes and the first of the spinach, packed in the flat wooden crates Wyatt had made for the purpose. Margaret received them with the same careful efficiency she brought to everything, inspected the produce without making a show of it, and paid Clara in cash at the price they'd agreed. Clara stood at the store counter with the coins in her hand and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not relief exactly, something more structural than relief, like a load-bearing element clicking into place. You'll have more next week? Margaret asked. More spinach, Clara said, and the first of the beans if this weather holds. The weather won't hold, Margaret said. It never does. Bring whatever you have. Clara bought 2 items she needed from Margaret's stock and put the rest of the payment in the purse inside her coat. And on the ride back to the ranch, she ran the arithmetic in her head with the pleasure of numbers that were finally moving in the right direction. She told Wyatt over supper. He listened to the figures with the careful attention of a man who has been operating on thinner margins than he preferred for long enough that any movement is significant. If the yield holds, she said, and I expand the cold frame by 1 section in the fall, which I can do with the lumber from the barn you said wasn't worth keeping, we could be looking at a consistent monthly income from the garden alone by spring. Consistent, Wyatt said, not large. Not large, she agreed, but consistent is different from large. Consistent means you can plan around it. He looked at the table. She had noticed over these weeks that when he was processing something important, he looked at surfaces near him rather than at the person speaking. Not evasion, just how he thought. She'd stopped interpreting it as disengagement. The feed invoice, he said. I know about the feed invoice, she said. He looked up. I wasn't snooping, she said. I picked up papers to clean under them, and it was on top. I put it back. I didn't say anything because it wasn't my business yet. Yet, he said. Things change, she said. This arrangement, what we have here, it's changed since the first week. I don't think we need to pretend it hasn't. He was quiet for a moment. I've been managing the feed debt, he said. It's not. I'm not in danger of losing the property. I want to be clear about that. I know, she said. I've read the water records. which means I've seen the property's income history too. You're not in danger of losing it, but you've been closer to the edge than you should be for a working ranch of this size." He didn't deny it. "Two people running this place is different from one," she said. "I think you know that. I think you've known it for a while and didn't have language for it." He looked at her directly. It was the look she'd learned to distinguish from his other looks, the one that had some cost to it, the one that required something from him to sustain. "I'm not good at it talking about what I have and don't have," he said. "I know," she said. "I've noticed. It's not something I'm proud of. It's not a character flaw," she said. "It's a learned behavior. When you've managed alone long enough, you stop reporting to anyone because there's no one to report to." He was quiet again. Eli was asleep. The lamp was low. Outside, the wind had picked up in the way it did in the evenings on the high ground, pressing against the walls of the house. "There was a woman," Wyatt said, "before I came out here, in Kansas." Clara waited. "We were going to be married," he said. "Her family was against it. Not the way the Caldwells were against you, not publicly, not with lawyers, just quietly, consistently against it until she decided it wasn't worth the difficulty." "She let them decide for her," Clara said. "She decided it was easier," he said, "which isn't the same thing, but it felt like the same thing at the time." "How long ago?" 8 years, he said. "I came out here the following spring." She looked at him across the table. 8 years was long enough that it had become part of the architecture of him. Not a wound exactly, more like a healed break. The bone had knit differently, and that was just how it was now. "Is that why you stepped in?" she said slowly. "At the station. Because someone let someone else make the decision." He thought about it. "Partly," he said. "Partly it was just, you had a 2-year-old on your hip and they were treating you like a returned package, and that's not something I can watch." "But partly," she said. "Partly," he said. She got up and cleared the dishes, and he got up and helped without being asked, and they worked side by side in the narrow kitchen space with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this particular thing enough times that their movements had stopped requiring negotiation. When the dishes were done, she dried her hands, and he was standing close enough that she was aware of it, not uncomfortably, just aware, and she turned and looked at him. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "About Kansas." "It seemed relevant," he said. "It was." She went to check on Eli. When she came back, Wyatt had gone out to do the last round of the evening. The animals, the barn, the check of the north fence in the dark that he did, because there'd been wolf sign 2 weeks ago, and he hadn't stopped watching for it. She sat at the table in the lamplight for a few minutes alone and thought about Kansas, and about a woman who had found the difficulty too great, and about what that had done to the man who came out to Wyoming the following spring and built something on a north ridge by himself for 6 years. She thought about what she'd said at supper. Things change. It was true, and she'd meant it as a practical statement, but she sat with it alone in the lamplight and understood. It was also more than that, and that understanding it was more than that was its own kind of risk. She was not Nathan Caldwell's mistake. She was not a woman waiting to be chosen. She had been very clear with herself about this from the moment she sat on that platform bench and decided not to get on the 4 o'clock train. But she was also a woman sitting at a kitchen table in Wyoming thinking about a man's careful honesty, and she was not going to pretend those two things weren't both true simultaneously. She blew out the lamp and went to bed. Harold Caldwell made his next move on a Friday. Clara learned of it from an unexpected source. She was in town for supplies, alone, Wyatt needed for the drainage work, when she encountered Nathan on the street outside the post office. He was on his way out as she was on her way in, and they both stopped. There was a moment of the specific awkwardness that exists between two people who have said important things to each other and then not seen each other for a stretch of time. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Caldwell," she said. He glanced behind him and then back at her. He had the look he'd had at the fence, the man holding two things that didn't fit together. "I was going to ride out," he said, "to the ranch. I have something you should know." "Tell me now," she said. He looked at the street around them. It was mid-morning and people were moving. "Not here," he said. "The hotel has a dining room. It's usually quiet this time of day." She looked at him for a long moment, weighing it. Then she nodded. The hotel dining room was quiet. They took a table near the window, away from the two other occupied tables. A woman brought coffee without being asked and left them alone. Harold is moving on the newspaper, Nathan said. Clara waited. The Hollow Creek Courier, he said. Harold knows the owner. Not well, but well enough. He's asked him to run a piece about Wyatt's property, about the water rights dispute. Nathan wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. And about you. What about me? Nathan looked at his coffee. The piece would characterize your presence on the ranch as improper, he said. That's the word Harold used, improper. It would reference the original complaint and the fact that you arrived in Hollow Creek to become a wife and ended up living on a single man's property instead. Without mentioning that the complaint was dismissed, Clara said. He'd leave that out, yes. And the tone. The tone would be… Nathan stopped. It would be the kind of thing that travels, the kind of thing people repeat, not a direct accusation. Something worse, something that makes people form an opinion without being told what opinion to form. Clara was very still. She understood this tactic the way she understood all of Harold's tactics, not because she was particularly sophisticated about such things, but because she had experienced the receiving end of them consistently enough to recognize the pattern. He couldn't beat her with legal mechanism. The petition had blocked that. He couldn't remove her with official complaint. That had been dismissed. So he was going to try to make her unwilling to stay, to make Hollow Creek feel like a place where her presence was a source of constant contamination, to make ordinary daily life, going to the store, driving through town, delivering produce to Margaret Pierce, feel like running a gauntlet. When does it run? She asked. Harold wants it in next Thursday's edition, Nathan said. The owner hasn't committed. I don't think he's enthusiastic about it, but Harold is applying pressure. What kind of pressure? Advertising, Nathan said simply. The Caldwell family is the largest advertiser in that paper, has been for 15 years. Clara looked at her coffee. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Not accusatory, just honest. Nathan looked up from his cup. Because I keep asking myself what I would have done differently if I'd been the kind of person I wanted to be, he said. And I can't come up with an answer that satisfies me. So I'm trying to do what I can now. What you're doing now could cost you, she said, with Harold, with your family. Yes, he said, it could. Is that all right with you? He thought about it. Really thought, not performed thought. No, he said finally. It's not all right with me. It's uncomfortable, and I'm not entirely sure where it ends. But it's less uncomfortable than the alternative, which is knowing I said nothing. Clara looked at him for a moment. There was something almost painful in the gap between who he was and who he might have been under different circumstances. It wasn't her job to bridge that gap, but she could acknowledge it existed. Thank you, she said. Again. He nodded. What will you do? Talk to the newspaper owner, she said, before Harold does. She left the hotel and went directly to the Hollow Creek Courier's office, which was 2 blocks west and identifiable by the smell of ink and the sound of the press even from the street. The owner was a thin, sharp-featured man named Lyle Cobb, who had been running the paper for 12 years, and who received Clara with the careful wariness of a man who has recently been contacted by powerful people about a sensitive matter and suspects that everyone who walks through his door is connected to it. She sat down across from his desk and told him the truth. Not a version of the truth, so the actual sequence of events, from the station forward, including the petition and its outcome, and the formal dismissal of the occupancy complaint. She was not emotional about it. She was clear and sequential, and she brought out the copy of the dismissal letter she had started carrying in her coat and set it on his desk. He read it. The board's formal finding, she said, is a matter of public record. If the Courier publishes a piece that omits this finding, it's publishing an incomplete account of a matter of public record. Lyle Cobb turned the letter over in his hands. The Caldwell family, he said, and didn't finish the sentence, has been your largest advertiser for 15 years, Clara said. I know, I'm not going to pretend that's not a real consideration for you. He looked at her. But you're also the man who decides what's true in this town, she said. Not what people want to be true. What gets written down. That's a serious thing to be. Most people who do serious things seriously take that responsibility seriously. Lyle Cobb set the letter on his desk and was quiet for a long moment. I haven't committed to anything, he said. I know, she said. Nathan Caldwell told me you hadn't. Something shifted in his expression when she said Nathan's name. Nathan came to you. Nathan told me what Harold was planning, she said. I came to you myself. You drove to town alone, he said, to come here. Yes. He looked at her for a moment that was longer than just assessment. It was closer to recognition. Then he picked up her dismissal letter and held it out to her. I'm not running Harold's piece, he said. I haven't decided yet what I'm running instead, but I'm not running that. She took the letter. I appreciate that. Don't thank me yet, he said. I haven't decided anything else. She drove back to the ranch in the thin afternoon light with her hands steady on the reins and her mind moving through what had happened. Nathan warning her. Lyle Cobb's face when she'd said the word serious. Margaret Pierce and Helen Garrity and Amos Fitch and the board's vote. She had arrived in Hollow Creek with $11 and no allies. She had, not by plan exactly, not by strategy in the calculated sense, but by the accumulation of being herself consistently, acquired a set of people who, for various and separate reasons, had decided her account of things was worth listening to. Harold Caldwell had more money and more history in this territory than she had or would have in her lifetime. But money and history operated best in the dark. Every time Harold made a move and Clara responded publicly, she brought light into the space where his methods worked. She was still thinking about this when she pulled up at the ranch and found Wyatt at the porch. He looked at her face as she climbed down from the wagon. What happened? She told him. The hotel. Nathan. Lyle Cobb. All of it, in order. He listened with his still paying attention silence. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, his hand on the porch rail. You went to the courier yourself, he said. There wasn't time to come back for you, she said. And it needed to be done today, not when Harold had already made his arrangements. I wasn't criticizing, he said. He stopped. You handled that well. Maybe, she said. Lyle Cobb hasn't committed to anything. He told you he's not running Harold's piece, Wyatt said. A man like Cobb saying that clearly is not a small thing. She moved past him to take the horse in and he fell in beside her, and they walked to the barn, in the particular easy silence that had become one of the things she didn't think about consciously anymore. It was just how they moved together on this property, side by side, without announcing it. In the barn she unhitched, and he handled the horse, and she hung the tack, and neither of them spoke for a few minutes because there wasn't anything that needed to be said right now, and they both understood that. It was Wyatt who broke it. I've been thinking, he said. I was brushing the horse with his back half turned to her, the way he sometimes talked when what he was saying had weight, and he wasn't sure where it was going to land. About what? She asked. About what this is, he said. Between us. What it's becoming. She stilled. I don't want to make it something it isn't, he said. I'm aware of how all this started. I'm aware that you didn't come here for me. You didn't choose this ranch or this arrangement because of anything to do with me personally. No, she said. I didn't. And you've been clear from the start that you won't be made to feel like you owe something you didn't agree to. I have, she said. So I want to say something that isn't an obligation, he said. And I need you to know it's not coming from... I'm not saying it because of what you've done for the ranch, or because of what we're going through with Harold, or because I feel sorry for you. He paused, set the brush down, turned to look at her. I'm saying it because it's just true, and it's been true for a while, and I'm getting worse at not saying it. She looked at him. He looked back at her. His face had the particular quality it had when something cost him, open in a way it usually wasn't, slightly unguarded, slightly uncertain, which on this man looked almost unfamiliar. I don't want you to stay here because you have nowhere else to go, he said. I want you to stay here because you want to. Because this place is yours too, in the way that matters. Not on paper. I'm not talking about paper. I'm talking about the cold frame and the records you organized and the fact that Eli knows every chicken by name and Price follows him everywhere he goes. He stopped. I'm talking about the fact that this ranch feels like something now, and the thing it feels like has to do with you being in it. Clara looked at him for a long moment. She had thought about this. She had thought about it in the lamplight after he'd told her about Kansas, and on the wagon ride back from town, and in the quiet of the mornings before anyone else was up. She had thought about the risk of it, not to her heart, though that too, but to the clarity she'd fought to establish about who she was and what she was doing and what she owed to whom. I'm not a simple situation, she said. I know that, he said. Eli is part of whatever this is. He's not separate from me. I know that too, he said. I've known that since the station. It was never a complication to me. I need you to understand that. It was never something I had to get past. She looked at the horse, who was indifferent to all of this, moving gently in the stall. She looked at the barn boards, the one mended section on the east wall. She looked at her own hands. I'm afraid, she said. Not ashamed of it, just stating it as one of the true things. Of what specifically? He asked. Of needing someone, she said. Of building something around another person and having it turn out that the person is different than I thought. I did that once. Not with my husband. He was a good man and his dying was not something either of us chose. But with the idea of Nathan, with the plan I had. She paused. I made a plan around someone I'd never met, and it cost me everything I had. I'm not a plan, he said. And you know me. I know you better than I knew Nathan, she said. That's true. You know me better than most people I've met have ever known me, he said. You've read my financial records. It came out with a slight dry quality that surprised her, and she felt something release in her chest. Not laughter exactly, but the thing that lives next to laughter. That's a particular kind of intimacy, she said. It is, he said. She looked at him directly. I'm not going to tell you yes right now, she said, not because the answer is no, but because I've learned that I make better decisions when I don't make them in the moment something is said. I need a day. All right, he said, you're not going to argue with that. No, he said, you know your own mind better than I do. She nodded. She walked out of the barn and across the yard and went inside to start supper. And she was aware that her hands were not entirely steady, and she didn't try to make them steady, just let them be what they were. Eli was awake from his afternoon nap and came padding out of the back room with his hair sideways and his shoe on the wrong foot, and she crouched down and switched the shoe, and he patted her head with one hand in the absent-minded way he had, like she was something he was reassuring without quite knowing why. Yat outside? He asked. Yes, she said. I go see Yat. Put your coat on, she said. He went for the coat peg with the determination of a child who has a destination in mind, and she watched him wrestle the coat on and go out the door, and she listened to his boots on the porch boards, and then his voice outside calling Wyatt's name with the particular confidence of a child who has never once called a name and not been answered. She heard Wyatt's voice from the direction of the barn. She heard Eli's feet change direction. She stood in the kitchen and listened to the sound of her son running toward someone who answered when he called, and she stood with it for a long moment before she turned back to the stove. The next morning she told Wyatt yes before breakfast, in the kitchen, with the stove going and Eli still asleep, in the same plain way she told him most important things, directly, without a build-up, because she had learned in the months of her life since Missouri that preamble was mostly a way of giving yourself time to talk yourself out of something you'd already decided. He looked at her. Yes, she said again. Not because I have nowhere else to go, because this is where I want to be. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. He put his coffee cup down and he looked at her the way he looked at things he was going to take care of, with the total quiet attention of a man whose word, once given, held. And that was enough. They had breakfast. They had the morning's work. Harold Caldwell still existed and his water rights dispute was still unresolved, and the independent assessor was due at the property in 2 weeks, and none of that had changed. The fence needed its last section. The cold frame needed tending. Price was asleep under the table and Eli was eating his breakfast in the focused, methodical way he attacked food that he enjoyed, and outside the Wyoming morning was doing what Wyoming mornings did, going about itself without asking anyone's permission. It was a week after that conversation, 7 days of ordinary work and ordinary meals, and the gradual deepening of something that didn't have a name yet but was becoming undeniable when the thing Clara had been waiting for happened. Harold Caldwell came himself, not his men on horseback, not his assessor's office intermediary, not his lawyer with a leather folder. Harold came in his own carriage on a Tuesday afternoon, and he came alone except for his driver, which was itself a kind of statement, that this was something he'd decided required him personally. Wyatt was in the north pasture. Clara was at the cold frame. She heard the carriage on the trail, and she straightened and looked, and she recognized the Caldwell carriage before she recognized the man in it, and she set down what she was holding and walked to the fence without hurrying. Harold Caldwell climbed down from the carriage. He looked at her across the fence with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not the cold indifference of the station, not the calculated removal of a man managing a situation at arm's length. This was something more direct than either of those things. This was a man who had run out of proxies and decided to come himself because the proxies hadn't worked. He was, Clara realized, here to look at her, to take the measure of her directly, in person, without intermediaries. Whatever he'd expected her to still be, frightened, diminished, ready to leave, he'd come to see whether it was true. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Caldwell," she said. He looked at the cold frame behind her, at the garden, at the repaired fence sections, at the house. "You've made yourself comfortable," he said. "I've made myself useful," she said. "There's a difference." He looked at her. "You've made things difficult," he said. "That's what you've done." "You were making things difficult," she said. "I was responding to that." Harold's jaw tightened. "I made a decision at that station," he said, "on behalf of my family and my brother, who is not, Nathan is not equipped to make certain kinds of decisions without guidance." "He seemed quite capable to me," Clara said, "when he came out here and warned me what you were planning." A muscle moved in Harold's face. "He came here." "He did," she said. "He's come twice, both times to tell me something I needed to know. He also told me you weren't aware of it, so I'm not telling you anything he'd consider private." Harold was quiet for a moment. Something in the quality of his quiet told her this was information that had weight for him, not about Clara, but about Nathan, about the specific kind of defection that happens inside a family when someone decides their conscience matters more than their position. "My brother is not your ally," Harold said finally. "I didn't say he was," Clara said. "He's a man who felt he'd done something he shouldn't have and was trying to partially make it right. Those people are useful to have around. They're also not people I depend on." "Then who do you depend on?" Harold asked. The question had an edge to it, almost contemptuous, but not quite, because contempt requires a certainty about the other person's weakness that Harold Caldwell no longer entirely had about Clara Whitmore. "Myself," she said, "and Wyatt, and about 6 people in town who've decided I'm worth knowing, and my son, who is 2 years old and doesn't have an opinion about any of this, which is honestly a relief." Harold looked at her. For a long moment he didn't say anything, and in that silence Clara could see him making a calculation she couldn't fully read, running some internal arithmetic about what was still possible and what had become impossible, and whether those two categories had shifted since he'd last counted them. "The assessor's review," he began. "We'll find Wyatt's records in perfect order," she said. "I organized them myself, every entry, every date, every measurement, going back 5 years. If you'd like to know what the independent assessor will find before he finds it, I'm happy to walk you through the documentation." Harold looked at her steadily. "You are not what I expected," he said. "I know," she said. "You expected someone who would leave." "Most people leave," he said. "I'm aware," she said. "That's how the method works. You apply enough pressure in enough different directions, and most people calculate that staying costs more than going. I understand the logic. I just," she looked at him directly, "I didn't have anywhere to go back to. That changes the calculation considerably." Something moved across Harold Caldwell's face. It wasn't respect exactly. It wasn't defeat exactly. It was the particular expression of a man who has reached the edge of his effective range and knows it, and is trying to decide whether to acknowledge that to himself or not. "The water rights dispute is not finished," he said. "We'll go through the review process," she said. "If Wyatt's records hold, and they will, and the independent assessor finds what the records show, then the dispute will be resolved in the way it should have been resolved before the Caldwell family decided to involve the assessor's office in matters of personal grievance." "That's a serious accusation," Harold said. "It's in the board's formal record," she said. "They found that the assessor's conduct warranted oversight. That's their language, not mine. I'm just repeating what's already written down." Harold looked at the house again, at the cold frame, at Clara standing at the fence in her work apron with the mud on her knees and her hands steady at her sides. "You're going to marry him," Harold said. It wasn't a question. Clara looked at him and said nothing. "That's what this is," Harold said. "You came here to be a wife, and you're going to be a wife, just not my brother's." "What I'm going to be," Clara said carefully, is my own business. But I'll tell you this, whatever I become in this territory, it will have nothing to do with your family's opinion of it. You don't get to define me. You tried that on a train platform, and it didn't work, and everything you've done since has been a variation on the same attempt. And it's not going to work either. Not because I'm exceptional, just because I'm determined, and determined turns out to be enough. Harold Caldwell stood at the fence for a moment longer. Then he put his hat back on. He'd been holding it, she noticed, this whole time, which was a thing men did when they wanted to signal something, and she hadn't remarked on it until now. And he turned back to his carriage. He stopped with his hand on the carriage door. "The review will proceed," he said, without turning around. "I won't interfere with it." Clara waited. "That's not a concession," he said. "The dispute is still—" "I understand," she said. "It's a statement of intent about the process. I'll take it as that." He got into the carriage. The driver turned it around on the trail with the same difficulty as always. There was never quite enough room. And it went back down the way it had come. Clara stood at the fence and watched it go. She was aware of her own breathing. She was aware of the cold frame behind her and the seedlings in it, and the fact that the afternoon light had shifted while she'd been standing here, and she had about an hour of good working light left. She heard boots on the ground behind her and turned. Wyatt was coming across the yard from the direction of the north pasture. He must have seen the carriage on the trail and come in. He looked at the road where the Caldwell carriage had gone, and then at Clara. "Harold," she said. "I figured," he said. He looked at her face. "You all right?" "Yes," she said. And then, "He said the review will proceed without interference." Wyatt went still. "He said that," Wyatt said. "Himself. In those words." "More or less," Clara said. "He also said it wasn't a concession and the dispute was still ongoing, which I believe is technically true. But the interference part—" She paused. "A man like Harold doesn't say that unless he's decided something." Wyatt looked at the road for a moment. "What did you say to him?" "The truth," she said. "Mostly." "The truth tends to land differently coming from you," he said. She looked at him, startled slightly by the plainness of it. "It lands like something with weight behind it," he said. "Not just words." She looked at the fence rail between them, at the repaired posts, the new wire, the solid line of it running north toward where his land met the high country. "Come on," she said. "I've got an hour of light left in the cold frame." "I'll help," he said. They went together back across the yard, and the ranch was quiet around them, and somewhere inside the house, Eli woke from his afternoon sleep and called out. Not frightened, just announcing himself as he did. And Clara called back, "Out here, Eli," and heard his feet hit the floor and the door open and his voice again, closer. The carriage was gone. The fence was mended. The cold frame held its rows of green. Whatever was coming next, the assessor, the board, the long resolution of the water dispute that would take months and not weeks, they would face it with documentation and with witnesses and with the kind of stubborn, patient presence that outlasts pressure because it simply refuses to go anywhere. That was what Clara Whitmore had learned across the whole improbable length of these months about how you hold ground that is yours. You stay. The independent assessor arrived on a Wednesday morning in October, 3 weeks after Harold Caldwell's visit to the fence. He was a compact, methodical man named Sutherland who had been sent from the territorial capital and who had, by all appearances, no prior relationship with anyone in Hollow Creek, which was precisely the point of requesting him. He arrived with his own ledger and his own measuring instruments, and a manner that suggested he intended to look at what was actually there rather than what anyone had told him to expect. Clara made coffee and left him and Wyatt to the records while she worked the cold frame. She had learned, in the months since the station, which situations required her presence and which required her to trust that the work already done would speak for itself. The water records were clean. She had organized them herself. There was nothing in them that needed her standing over anyone's shoulder to explain. She heard them in the main room for 2 hours. The occasional question, Wyatt's low responses, the sound of pages turning. Eli sat in the garden and moved dirt from one place to another with the philosophical patience of a child who has learned that some mornings adults do incomprehensible things, and the best response is to wait them out. When Sutherland came out to inspect the well and the irrigation lines, he did it carefully and without conversation, measuring and noting and measuring again. Clara watched from the cold frame without watching, the sideways attention of someone who knows better than to hover. At noon, he sat at the kitchen table and wrote in his ledger for 20 minutes. Then he closed it. The records are consistent with the physical evidence, he told Wyatt. Your draw is within the established parameters for a property of this size. There's no evidence of unauthorized diversion or excessive use. He paused. I'll submit my findings to the board within the week. My recommendation will be that the water rights dispute be resolved in your favor. Wyatt nodded once. I'd also note, Sutherland said, picking up his hat, that the records appear to have been recently reorganized. They're unusually clear for ranch documentation of this age. They were, Wyatt said. He looked at Clara briefly. Someone put time into that. Sutherland followed his gaze to Clara, who was at the stove and didn't make anything of the look. Good record-keeping wins more disputes than lawyers do, he said, which was as close to an opinion as he'd offered all morning, and then he left. Wyatt stood in the kitchen doorway after the assessor's wagon disappeared down the trail. Clara came to stand beside him. That's it, she said. That's the main thing, he said. The board will formalize it. Could take another month. But Sutherland's finding is the finding. She looked at the road. A month more of waiting, of the dispute technically unresolved, of Harold Caldwell technically still having a claim on the process. But the claim was hollow now, and everyone involved knew it. He's not going to fight a documented finding from an independent assessor, she said. Not publicly. It would cost him more than the water rights are worth. No, Wyatt said. He's not. She had been right about Harold. After the assessor's visit, there was nothing more from the Caldwell family. No letters, no men on horseback, no attempts through the newspaper or the assessor's office. The silence was not conciliatory. It was the silence of a man who had decided to stop spending resources on a return that wasn't coming. Harold Caldwell was practical before he was anything else, and the practical calculation had finally shifted. The board issued its formal resolution in November. Wyatt's water rights were confirmed. The matter was closed. Clara read the resolution letter at the kitchen table on a Thursday morning and set it down and sat with it for a moment. Just a moment. Then she got up and went back to work because there was bread to make, and the cold frame needed its winter covering, and Eli had somehow gotten mud into his left boot, despite there being no mud within 20 feet of where he'd been playing. That was the other thing she had learned, and maybe the most important one. Resolution doesn't announce itself the way you imagine it will when you're in the middle of the fight. There's no particular feeling of doors closing or burdens lifting. Life just continues. And what changes is that a particular weight is no longer there, and you notice it the way you notice a sound that's stopped, in the quiet afterward. Wyatt and Clara were married in December in the Hollow Creek Courthouse, with Amos Fitch and Margaret Pierce as witnesses. It was not a ceremony that anyone would have called elaborate. There were no flowers because it was December and nothing was flowering. Eli wore his good shirt and stood between them with the formal gravity of a 3-year-old who understands that something significant is happening and has decided to behave accordingly. Margaret brought a jar of preserved plums from the store, which was her version of celebration, and Amos shook Wyatt's hand and told Clara she was one of the more sensible people he'd met in 30 years of notary work, which she took as the compliment he intended. They drove home in the wagon in the cold December afternoon, with Eli asleep between them, and the ranch came into view around the long curve in the trail, and it looked, as it always did, like itself. The house, the barn, the cold frame dormant for winter, the fence line solid and mended and running north toward the high country. It was not a perfect life. She would not have trusted it if it had been. The fence needed work again by spring. It always did. That was the nature of fences and weather and Wyoming. The feed costs went up in the second year, and they had a hard month in March, when the cold frame lost 2 weeks of seedlings to an unexpected freeze, and Clara had to recalculate the spring planting from scratch. Wyatt was not an easy man to live with in the way that all independent people are not easy to live with. He carried his silences too long sometimes, and there were evenings when whatever he was working through in his head was not something he was ready to share, and she had to learn the difference between giving him room and letting him disappear. She was not easy either. She was particular about how things were organized, and she knew it, and she didn't entirely apologize for it. Eli grew. That was the thing that happened most visibly and most irreversibly in those years. The boy grew. He grew into the ranch the way children grow into places they're given enough time to know, completely, unconsciously, in the way that makes a place inseparable from the person. He knew every fence post on the north line. He knew which of the horses tolerated his presence and which merely accepted it. He learned to read from a primer Clara ordered from the catalog, sitting at the kitchen table in the evenings with the lamp between them, and he was dogged about it. Not quick, but he didn't let things beat him, which was a quality she recognized and did not take credit for, and was quietly proud of anyway. Nathan Caldwell left Hollow Creek in the second year. Clara heard about it from Margaret. He'd gone east, to Missouri of all places, which struck her as either ironic or simply the way things cycle. She didn't hear from him directly. She thought about him occasionally, the way you think about someone who had a small but real role in something that changed your life. And she hoped he was all right, and that was the full extent of what she could offer him. Some debts of conscience can't be repaid between people who are no longer in each other's lives. You carry them to the next thing you do and try to do that better. Harold Caldwell remained in the territory. She saw him twice in town over the following years. Once across the street outside the feed store, once in Margaret's shop at the same moment Clara was there for her weekly delivery. Both times he looked at her, and she looked at him, and nothing was said. He was older. He looked, she thought, like a man who had spent years being the largest force in a small room and was slowly noticing the room getting larger. She did not feel triumph when she saw him. She felt something closer to clarity, the recognition that a thing is finished, not won exactly, just finished. There is something that Clara Whitmore understood in the years on that ranch that she had not understood on the platform at Hollow Creek Station with her crumpled letter at her feet. She had thought, in those first awful minutes, that what had been done to her was about her, that Harold Caldwell's contempt was a judgment on some true deficit she possessed, that the right response was to prove she was worth something, to demonstrate her value until someone believed it. But that was not what she learned. What she learned was that people like Harold Caldwell don't operate on truth. They operate on compliance. What he'd wanted from her on that platform was not evidence that she was unworthy. He already knew she wasn't unworthy. What he wanted was for her to accept his version of her and act accordingly, to board the 4 o'clock train, to remove herself from the equation, to confirm that his assessment had force because she treated it as though it did. And what broke his hold was not Clara proving him wrong. It was Clara simply continuing to exist, to work, to be present, and documented, and known by the people around her, until the version of her that Harold had tried to install in the territory's understanding of events had no room left to stand. That is not a romantic lesson. It does not make for a tidy ending. It means that the real work of a person's life is frequently unglamorous and consists largely of showing up, keeping records, planting things, and refusing to disappear when someone with more power decides your disappearance would be convenient. She thought about this on a morning 3 years after the assessor's visit, standing in the garden in the early spring light with her hands in the soil and Eli somewhere behind her arguing with the chickens about something they'd done that he found unreasonable, and Wyatt on the porch with his coffee watching all of it with the expression she had learned over years of waking up in the same house as him to read as contentment. Not the performed contentment of a man telling himself he is satisfied, but the quiet of a man who has run out of reasons to be anywhere else. She looked at the cold frame, which had its 3rd season of seedlings in it now. She looked at the fence, which was mended. She was 42 years old. She was tired in the specific way of people who have worked hard at real things for a long time. She was not who she had been on that platform, and she was not who she had imagined she would be when she'd written careful letters to a man with a two-centered hat in a formal photograph. She was something she had not planned and could not have planned, something assembled from necessity and stubbornness and the specific grace of being seen, at a critical moment, by someone who asked nothing in return for seeing her. She thought about women like her, all the ones before and after, who had stood in some version of that station, who had been evaluated and found lacking by people who had no right to do the evaluating, who had been handed someone else's story about them and told to carry it as if it were true. Most of them had carried it, not because they were weak, but because the weight of sustained resistance is genuinely heavy, and you can only refuse to put it down if you have somewhere to stand. She had been lucky. She knew this. Wyatt Mercer had been standing across the platform, which was luck. Margaret Pierce had been the kind of woman she was, which was luck. Garrity had been on the county board, which was luck. None of it was inevitable. None of it was guaranteed to anyone. But she had also made choices. She had gotten off the bench and picked up the suitcase. She had said no to the 4 o'clock train. She had organized the water records and walked into the newspaper office and stood at the fence when Harold came and looked him in the eye and told him the truth in plain language. Those were not luck. Those were hers. That is the only lesson she would have offered anyone who asked, in those years, what she had learned from all of it. Not that goodness triumphs, or that the right person finds you, or that hard work is always rewarded, because none of those things are reliably true, and she was not in the business of comfortable fictions. Only this: when someone hands you a story that makes you smaller than you are allowed to refuse it. You don't have to be eloquent about it. You don't have to win dramatically. You just have to refuse it clearly, and then get up the next morning and refuse it again, for as many mornings as it takes. Eli came across the yard with a chicken under his arm, still arguing his case. Wyatt, from the porch, said something she couldn't hear that made the boy laugh. Price lifted his old gray head from the porch boards and then laid it back down. The spring light was thin and cold and real. Clara pressed her hands into the soil and kept working.
Chipotle burrito bowls, all homemade for. Oh, that sounds fucking amazing. I love that for you. Fuck yeah. If you had a recipe, would you be down to like share in the Discord in the food section? In the nom section? I'd love to learn about this if you have a recipe for it. I love burrito bowls though. It's one of my absolute favorites. So I might have to get some minced beef this week. The chicken, oh, it's chicken chipotle, black beans, made corn salsa, and pico de gallo tomorrow. Ooh, yes, please. Fuck, that sounds amazing. All right. Is it like a shredded chicken style type of thing? Is that what you're doing? Ooh, like creme fraiche type of thing? Crema? Is that what you mean?